Welcome to Person-Centered Recovery Planning, a review of plan components. This video will provide a brief overview of Person-Centered Recovery Planning, or PCRP, with an emphasis on the 5 core components that we expect to find in any planning process or within any written plan document. Here's what we'll cover. We'll begin with a simple definition along with some guiding principles. From there, we'll take a look at the different types of information that people naturally gather when we support them and learn about their lives and their wishes for recovery. In fact, the main focus of this course is to offer practical tips about how to ensure that we obtain meaningful recovery planning information through conversations with people, as well as how that information can be organized into standard elements or plan components in a way that doesn't diminish the voice of the person represented. Of course, there's some variation in what these core plan components may be titled on recovery plans within specific programs or agencies, but we'll show what critical function each of the components serves and why each is a necessary part of any comprehensive person-centered recovery plan. You'll see here that those components for this course will be referred to as the following: goals, strengths and barriers, objectives, also known as short-term goals, and actions, including professional billable services and actions taken outside of the formal system, but that still get described on the plan. Okay, here are a few ways to think about PCRP along with some overarching principles. Much of this might be familiar to you or represent your personal values already. So, what is a person-centered recovery plan? There are a variety of excellent wellness planning tools that are completely separate from clinical services out there. A great example of this is WRAP, Wellness Recovery Action Plan, developed by Mary Ellen Copeland. These plans may or may not include professional services because they are completely owned by the individual, and that individual chooses whether to share that document with professional supporters or not. In fact, that person may or may not be receiving professional services. Here, when we talk about person-centered recovery plans, PCRP, I'm speaking about professional service planning that is done within a behavioral health program or agency in order to identify which services that person chooses. Every program must have a service plan in order to provide and be reimbursed for those services. Historically, those plans have existed only to meet the needs of the agency and the behavioral health system, and they've tended to exclude the individual or family's broader recovery and wellness goals. In many cases, those traditional service or treatment plans have only represented the recommendations and insights of the professionals. In order to repair a system that has traditionally not honored people's right to make their own healthcare decisions and take full ownership over their lives, there have been a series of legislative and regulatory actions that make it clear that the expectation is to provide high quality, person-centered care and planning. Therefore, we see person-centered, patient-centered, consumer-driven, family-centered as widespread expectations for behavioral health programming and service delivery by various oversight and regulatory agencies. In other words, it's not enough for traditional clinical programs to offer innovative recovery-oriented services like peer support and self-directed wellness planning classes. They must also hold clinical professionals accountable for being person-centered in their approach as well. So what about a simple definition? What I like to say, because we throw around the word needs quite a bit in this field, is that we can't know what a person needs until we first understand what it is that they want. And we're going to come back to this concept of needs versus wants in just a minute. The National Center on Advancing Person Centered Practices and Systems, also known as NCAPS, offers us this definition. Person centered planning is a way to learn about the choices and interests that make up a person's idea of a good life and to identify the supports, paid and unpaid, needed to achieve that life. Okay, so this is a central concept in PCRP. It invites us to think a little bit more about the difference between needs and wants. Another way to view this concept is by saying important to the person versus important for the person. I have found this concept to be an excellent way to sum up PCRP and its philosophy and practice. I also think it can be used as a practical tool when working with people and their supporters to amplify what that individual finds important to them. In other words, their source of motivation. Sometimes people call this their hopes and dreams category, and how that differs from the more practical, important for outcomes that might be less motivating, less inspiring, but are also important to talk about. On traditional plans, we tended to only see those items in the important for column, things like basic health and safety, management of clinical symptoms, harm reduction, legal obligations and mandates. However, the defining feature of a person centered approach is the opposite. People's wants, their hopes and dreams become the driving force behind the more mundane and less appealing short term outcomes that still have a place in the planning process, but only as a means to assist people in achieving those outcomes that are more meaningful. Okay, the National Center on Advancing Person Centered Practices and Systems, NCAPS, prepared a national overview of person centered principles across aging and disability systems, including the mental health system. And that effort produced a unified definition that you saw earlier, as well as these four main principles of person centered practices. And you see these here on screen. The first one is a focus on the person. The person is at the center of the planning process. Their desires should be heard, honored, and valued. People who are important in the person's life should be part of that process. Number two, choice and self-determination. People should make choices with support if they want about services and supports, as well as decisions regarding their own health, well-being, and life goals. Number three is community inclusion. I think this one gets left behind quite a bit, especially in behavioral health. The description here is that people must have full access to the community and be treated with dignity and respect. And then number four is the availability of services and supports. People should have access to an array of individualized services that meet their particular needs. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. NCAPS also offers 3 characteristics or themes from an environmental scan of person-centered planning definitions and program characteristics. The first one was about information. Information should be provided in a clear and meaningful way in order for people to understand options and make informed decisions. The second is about coordinated supports. A few resources discuss the need for providers to work together to deliver services and the importance of having cohesion and continuity with supports. I think this is incredibly challenging in our complex system. And then the final one is positive expectations. This theme comes mainly from the mental health field and stems from the belief that recovery can be a reality. In other fields, the assumption that improvement and growth are possible is important for person-centered practices. So that hope, that belief that people can and will recover and achieve the life that they want. Just to note that the NCAPS website is a great source of tools and resources that are free and available to you. So let's spend a minute talking about getting to know the person and making that connection human to human as we begin the planning process. It can be overwhelming when we begin the planning process. There's so much for us to do, and sometimes it's overwhelming to think about where do we start. Most of us learned this little phrase in school, and I've heard it again and again, that we start where the person is. And I think that that can be a really grounding reminder. If we find out what that person is experiencing, needing, and expecting in that moment that we're meeting with them, it's a really great place to start. Also, making a quick but meaningful connection, something simple like asking how they are, what they most need to accomplish in that moment, can really break down some pretty major barriers. I think paying attention to the relationship in general is something that is often forgotten. I once heard someone say relationship before task, and that phrase has stuck with me for many years. And I've often thought about, is that the rule that we should make a connection before we jump into more concrete tasks? And I'll invite you to think about that. What do you think about relationship before task? Um, I don't think that there's a clear answer to that. I do want to be clear that paying attention to the relational aspect of this work doesn't mean that we're fostering friendship with people or diverting attention away from the role that we're there to perform. In fact, different clients will seek different kinds of relationships with their providers. And many people, they want you to get on with it. They want you to perform the job that they know you're there to do. And so I think what's most important is listening to what kind of relationship that individual wants and being ready to be responsive to what they're telling you they want in that relationship. People have said, people who are in recovery have indicated in research and on feedback surveys repeatedly that they really need to be treated as a human being rather than a case or a diagnosis. And so I think figuring out how to translate those wishes on a case by case or person by person basis is our biggest challenge. And then finally, here, professionals are still expected to be an active participant and to shape the process and accomplish the tasks needed to achieve the immediate asks and needs of the person. The professionals carry the responsibility for facilitating the decisions that need to be made, often in a relatively short period of time. They know what information is critical to collect in order to have the full picture needed to get started with an initial recovery plan that can always evolve over time and expand. The professional knows what the agency and program oriented mandates are that must be achieved in order to get the person the resources that they need. So the professional is an active participant in this relationship. So this is where the tension comes in. And I think Dr. Patricia Deegan, a person with lived experience, clinical psychologist, researcher, national leader in the recovery movement, speaks about this tension really well when she talks about our efforts to support a person existing along a continuum where we're always trying to stay balanced, where neglect is at one end of the continuum and over control is at the other. And the collaborative approach, where supporters intentionally make space for the person in recovery to ask for and receive the kind of support that they want, requires constant attention to the relationship. And honestly, it can be really challenging for professionals who might prefer to default to a more prescriptive or expert driven approach. I have personally found in my years of clinical work and time spent as a clinical supervisor that this approach to supporting people is not only more effective in achieving important recovery outcomes, for people, but it also makes the work for professionals more rewarding. If you're interested in working with this concept a little bit more, you can pause the video and take a few minutes to think about the various healthcare providers that you've received services from over the years, whether it be mental health or other, and jot down some specific actions and observations that fall along this continuum. If you're watching this video as a group or team, you can take turns sharing those experiences or even plotting those examples using sticky notes on a whiteboard. This can also be a helpful tool for supervision or consultation groups, or even debriefing events with people in services or their natural supporters. So, as we finish out this section, thinking about getting to know the person and finding out what really matters in their story, here are some basic questions that I'm always trying to get answers to when I'm developing a written recovery plan in collaboration with a person. Without thinking about any planning document or standardized assessment, let's take a look and see if it matches what you're interested in when you're getting to know someone. I'm always wondering what's wanted by that person. What's their vision of a quality life that important too? How are they similar to me or different from me? What gives them strength and hope? How are things not worse than they are right now? How have they been able to overcome difficulties in the past? And then what are they really struggling with? What's standing in their way right now? What is the behavioral health barrier they experience in their day-to-day life? And how does it show up exactly? How would their day-to-day functioning or their life look if that barrier was overcome? In other words, what are the desired results of the support that they're seeking? And then finally, what actions can they take right now to promote their wellness? And how does what I have to offer fit or not fit into what they want? When we ask people what they want and really listen to what they have to share with us, especially when we can demonstrate that we're worthy of their trust, we can figure out how to follow their lead. We can figure out how to provide support in a way that honors what role they're asking us to play in their recovery. It's our job to ask the right questions and figure out how to leverage the available services and programs into what they want rather than the other way around. That's a really easy trap to fall into, right? Here's my menu of services, so it's what I'm going to offer you before I even ask what you need. Because sometimes their wants and needs may necessitate that we get creative about what the existing set of services offers. So we expand or advocate for program improvements to be responsive to the person's needs, assuming it's still within the role of the program. Otherwise, we can consider coordinating with other community-based programs or even non-professional solutions to fill in those gaps. What about organizing information into these plan components? Let's look at a basic framework for doing this. You may have seen this before. Let's review the 5 core components, including what makes each component unique in a person-centered model compared to a more traditional approach. We've got a goal at the top, and of course, the word goal is used quite a bit, but as you may already know, in a person-centered approach, it really is about what's important to the person. It's the vision of the life that they want. And the function of the goal is really to tap into the current motivation for change. Then we've got strengths and barriers. In a person-centered approach, we really want to find out strengths and barriers from a more practical angle. What are the things that the person can leverage immediately? What can they build on intentionally to promote their own wellness. Those are strengths. And the barriers, what are their day to day struggles? What's actually getting in the way of the life that they want? And then next are objectives. We can also think of these as short term goals. This is probably the most widely confusing or challenging component of the planning process. These are the outcomes that we anticipate will be the signs of progress. How will the person and others know that the services and supports are effective? How will we measure the desired results? And then, last but certainly not least, what are the actions? Or historically, we've called these interventions. And in a person centered plan, we're not just going to include the professional billable services, but also the personal action steps. I've heard these called personal wellness strategies before, and also the natural supporter actions. This framework, as well as a handout with some simple questions that providers might ask to get information for each plan component, is available for download if you're interested. But let's look a little bit more closely at each of these components. Okay, the goal. Remember, you may have to unlearn a little bit about goal in order to adopt this model of PCRP. So it's really about what's wanted, what's important to the person. So it's 100% owned by the individual. Reclaiming the term goal is one of the biggest shifts in the PCRP model. And it's just as important to understand what it's not. So, oftentimes, when you ask someone about their goal or what kind of life they want, people will often communicate what they wish to move away from. So, they might say, I wish to no longer hear disturbing voices, or I no longer want to be depressed. And in those instances, what they're actually communicating are their barriers. And that, of course, is extremely important information. It's just not telling us what they want to move toward. It's not telling us about their goals. Strong, motivating goals are always about movement toward something wanted and will meet the dead person's test. So, meaning if a dead person could meet the goal, like stay out of jail or um, stay out of the hospital, it's not actually a goal, but a barrier, something to avoid. So, keep your eye out for when a barrier disguises itself as a goal. So, you as a supporter might ask, what do you want for your life? And they might say, I want these awful voices to go away, or I'll be able to stay out of the hospital. And they may need us in that moment to validate their experience and discuss how those barriers are impacting their life in a negative way. We may need to stay with the conversation about barriers a little bit, right? And starting where that person is. But let's just be clear that when we talk about goals, we're talking about what is wanted. So whenever it seems appropriate, we can direct the conversation beyond the alleviation of their immediate suffering or crisis and explore what they want their life to look like once those immediate barriers are resolved. We can ask questions like, if the voices were no longer a problem, what do you think your life might look like? Or let's say you're out of the hospital. What would you be doing ideally? So, just like we saw a bit earlier, the important to versus the important for distinction is also a really helpful tool when assisting someone in identifying a goal that will serve as a powerful motivator for recovery. Things that we must do that are good for us are great to include on the plan, but they deserve the important status of a goal? No. Or would they be better suited for a shorter term goal or objective, something that's a necessary marker toward a more meaningful outcome? For instance, I was recently traveling around the state as part of an evaluation project, doing some interviews with people who participate in a program living in a supported housing environment. And some of our interview questions were about the ability of the program to meet their basic needs, such as safety and a safe living environment, getting plenty of food, choices about services. But then we also asked whether the program was helping them work toward their bigger goals in life. And this is where things got really interesting. Some people in the program assured us that yes, and other people had some really amazing hopes and dreams, but that weren't being addressed by the program. And just from being asked the question, they were really, really excited to talk about these aspirations for their future that they had not been invited to share by other supporters. A few people also reported a goal that really fell more into the important four category, right? And I'll give you an example. We heard some people talk about they wanted to stop smoking. That was kind of a theme. And so I responded by saying something like, "Oh, I've heard that that's really hard. I wonder what's, why you're trying to do that since it's such a hard thing to accomplish." And I really got people's attention with that question. It seemed like it was something that had kind of been put upon them or something they'd been told they should do. A couple people had good answers when I asked, why are you trying to stop smoking? A couple people explained that the reason why they were trying to stop smoking is because they wanted to save money. They were spending lots of money on cigarettes, and if they had more money each month, they would be able to go out and go on dates and go do more socially. And one gentleman was saving up to get a bicycle. So it was really interesting to see the connection between kind of the short term important for of I want to stop smoking so that I can save money, and then the important two outcomes of if I have a bike, I'll be able to get a job and I'll have more money to go out and do fun things socially. So, being able to categorize these outcomes into important for versus important two, I think can be really useful. And I think is, again, a key concept in person centered recovery planning. So let's look a little bit closer at these short-term outcomes, which we're calling objectives. So again, objectives are the desired results, the anticipated short-term measurable achievements. They describe concrete changes in a person's behavior that are expected to happen in the near future once those immediate barriers are overcome. Another way to think about objectives is they are proof that the actions and services are helping the person make progress toward the life that they want. This is where we find treatment outcomes. This is where that good old SMART criteria, everybody knows about the SMART criteria. Rather than talking about SMART goals and PCRP, we often talk about SMART objectives. These are simple and specific, they're measurable, they're attainable, they're relevant to the person's goal, and they have a time frame. So you are measuring their completion, you're thinking about when the person will be able to accomplish the outcome. Because objectives need to meet these different quality standards, they tend to have a bit of a framework to them or a way that they read. So let's look at some sample objectives and see if we can identify the basic anatomy of an objective. So the first one here is within the next 90 days, Brian will be able to sleep a minimum of 6 hours per night for an entire week as the result of feeling safer in the home. Second example, within the next 2 months, Joanne will be able to take the bus to the local library 4 times. as the result of less anxiety from hearing voices. And the third, Eddie will be able to speak to 5 strangers in the community for 2 to 3 minutes as the result of increased confidence and new social skills within the next 4 weeks. I think you can see in these sample objectives the different SMART criteria, but also the connection to the disruption of the specific barrier in the person's day to day functioning. One great reminder is that in a person centered approach, we are not measuring people's service participation as a way of measuring their progress. So, oftentimes, it's helpful to think about at the beginning of any objective that's written, you can imagine this phrase: as the result of services and supports, this person will. We know that historically, people may have attended services for years and not improved, not gotten the quality of life outcomes that they deserve and that they want. So, if we're measuring the impact of services, we can't simply measure whether or not they're showing up to those services. A couple more notes about the difference between objectives and interventions or actions. Since both of these components involve behaviors on the part of the person in recovery, and they both show the person moving closer to their long term goal, they can be easily confused. So let's look at 2 easy ways to differentiate these 2 components. Actions or services are something that the person can start right away. These are actions that are not being measured as a sign of progress. Remember, they aren't outcomes. Objectives are something the person is working toward, it's out there in the future. It's an outcome or result that they likely can't accomplish today or tomorrow, but a marker of progress in the future. Even in circumstances where we might develop what we call a maintenance objective with someone that measures the person's ability to maintain progress over time, it's still an outcome that we're measuring. It's not an action step in order to better their life. Think about evaluation, assessment, outcomes. Objectives are outcomes. Another important distinction between actions and objectives is they have a cause effect relationship. You're taking this action in order to produce this result. And so, depending on the individual, it's going to be different, right? So, you need to think about that person. They're going to take this step in order to produce this outcome. All right, let's go over a few more quality requirements for action steps or interventions. When it comes to professional services, we talk about the who, what, when, and why. And there needs to be enough individualization to the person and their recovery, either in the plan itself, ideally, is the best practice, or when progress notes are linked to the plan. As we've said, any person centered recovery plan includes actions by the person and their natural supporters. This adds value by focusing on what the person can do right now. It's an opportunity to bring in their strengths and use language that's meaningful to the person. This doesn't replicate professional services. It's always things outside of the formal system that the person can do. So you would never see take medication. And then when it comes to natural supporter actions, it's really important to remember that we have a responsibility to work with the person and services to consider what role their natural supporters will play in their recovery process. Natural supporter action steps are one way to bring them into the process and into their everyday recovery. Whether or not that natural supporter is there in the planning meeting, they can still show up on the plan and reflect the decisions that the person in recovery is making about the role people will play in that recovery process. Here's one more interesting connection between a person's individual strengths and their personal action steps. Let's look at this example between Heidi and Mark. They both have the goal of wanting to get a job. However, we see when we look at their strengths, some differences in who they are, their identity, their personality, and what they can do. So Heidi has really strong computer skills, and she doesn't have a close connection to her physical community. She's willing to relocate to a different city for the right job opportunity. She's very well connected to an online community of supporters and friends. On the other hand, Mark has really strong interpersonal skills and relationships within the physical community. He's really comfortable taking the bus. He lives near the bus stop. He is eager to find a job within that community. He may not use the computer a lot. He's got a lot of local relationships to lean on, that network of relationships. So we will see these differences in strength throughout the rest of the plan. So let's look at the two objectives. So for Heidi's objective, within the next 30 days, Heidi will complete 3 job applications online as the result of clearer thinking. So even though we don't see her barriers described here on this example, we can tell in this objective that her barrier right now is that she's struggling with some problems with her thinking. And right now she cannot complete 3 job applications, or it would not be an objective. Mark, within the next 30 days, Mark will submit 3 job applications in person to local businesses as the result of clearer thinking. Same thing, we can tell that Mark is struggling with the barrier of difficulty with his thinking. The outcome that he's working toward that he can't do immediately is to be able to submit some job applications in the community. And then the personal action step for each looks a little different. Heidi is going to look for available jobs online for a minimum of 30 minutes per week. This is an action step she can take immediately. She may not be ready to submit an application, but she can look online. It's something that she has assured us she's ready to do. Mark, right now, as a personal action step for his own wellness, is going to engage in one activity outside of the home every day. So again, we just want to see that people's strengths, what they can do right now, their interests are being actively used to support their own wellness and their recovery. Here is a tip sheet for developing an objective and anticipating meaningful short-term outcomes with people. The connection between barriers, action steps, and anticipated results or objectives is demonstrated here. So for people who are supporters who are focused a lot on action steps, this logic can be really helpful as a way to develop more meaningful objectives that go beyond service participation by asking simple questions like, how is the behavioral health issue showing up in the person's day-to-day functioning? And if they take that recommended action, how will their life be different? What will they be able to do that they can't do right now? So this is available for download if you'd like a copy. In summary, the 5 core components fit together to tell a full story of who the person is and how they'll be supported to move forward in their recovery. Full plans typically have 1 goal statement, strengths and barriers, around 3 objectives, and action steps that connect to each of those objectives. Plan documents will also typically have some type of narrative section where a summary can be captured, including the person's preferences, perhaps any recommendations that weren't accepted by the person at that time, deferred needs from an assessment that may be addressed later on, and other info that provides helpful context. We also typically see demographics and diagnoses, maybe a crisis plan or advanced directive section. This learning series focuses on the development of these core components, which again might be titled something slightly different across programs or templates, but should all be present on any person centered, recovery oriented service plan.